So welcome to another episode of Talking Tech. Today I'm joined by Matt Keeble. Infrastructure and cloud guru is probably the way I was going to describe you. But
very kind.
maybe maybe you could do a little introduction to kind of you and your background, Matt.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I started in IT in the 1980s for my sins. I started working in 1986. So the first sort of, let's say, third of the career was all sort of application development on various platforms. Mainly in sort of banking, sort of trading system sort of domain. And then I think where it sort of started to change a bit was I got a job working for a very small software house doing automated testing, which was largely in the cards domain, but also did stuff for the Bank of England, things like this. They really need people who are comfortable doing sort of interface programming, quite low level stuff. So once I got automated testing on my CV, then all manner of things come about. So I ended up as a contractor. I contracted for many years as well, but where I really sort of got onto the DevOps journey was I ended up working for a consultancy that did testing and more DevOps as it became more and more prevalent with two things going in hand. Yeah. So that was really sort of when I worked. I worked in government for about sort of 7 years through this consultancy, and as the cloud platforms came in, you had the need to be able to configure and manage platforms and build pipelines and all the rest of it. So that's where I really sort of got into the DevOps piece. Okay. And then since those days, I've kind of used all those skill sets. And I find actually that if you've got an application background and you're used to sort of building, testing, deploying the actual application side of things, if you get into the infrastructure management stuff, obviously you need that to be able to deploy into. And then the last thing is you've got to be able to automate the whole lot and make it compatible. So that's how I've kind of morphed into the DevOps scene more in more recent times.
And I know when we had a brief chat a couple of weeks ago about topic and DevOps, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And you said that kind of infrastructure, cloud, DevOps, deployment, automation is all in together. I suppose from your perspective, what does DevOps mean? What does that actually conjure up for you when it's talking about technology?
Yeah, so for me, it's really just a facilitator of other things. That's the way I look at it, really. You want to be able to facilitate agile development. Obviously, it's been the big thing for a while. Yeah. But just saying you're agile and having stand-ups and other ceremonies doesn't make you agile. To me, it's the sort of engineering that underpins that. So you've got the sort of agile stuff that actually allows you to build stuff and test it and everything else. And then you've got obviously to be able to manage the platforms that you're putting these things on. So again, it's like, well, how do you do that? Everyone can point and click in AWS or Azure or whatever, but you try and repeat what they've done when they go on holiday, So all of this stuff is really about making sure you get sort of repeatable outcomes in terms of, sort of your infrastructure management. You can manage change over time. You can build your applications. But the other thing about it is the security and compliance piece that it delivers. It's huge for that. But the ultimate thing is to allow you to support your operating models. To me, it's a business support thing, and as is building applications, deploying applications, everything else, it really is about supporting the business. And if you're getting it right, no one should know it's going on, really. But to me, it's just a facilitator. But that probably underpins, when I say it's just a facilitator, if you don't have it, you a lot of businesses now can't be viable. So it's got to be absolutely spot on, but it should be something you don't really notice.
I feel like it's one of those things that, as you said, if you don't have it right, it's very clear and visible.
Exactly.
If you do have it right, no one knows you don't get the credit.
Exactly. Yes. I would say that, though, wouldn't I? I'd like to know which side of that fence I'm on, actually, but...
Well, I find with those kind of things, it's always... if it goes wrong, it's your fault. If it goes right, then you don't get any credit.
No, that's exactly it. And I mean, without sort of naming names, there's been some very, very high profile things in retail and sort of manufacturing and all sorts of things recently. To me, that's kind of a symptom of what must be going on in this area, basically. So to me, it's vitally important, and I think there isn't enough importance placed on engineering this stuff right, not just to be able to stand things up, but be able to actually manage them over time. That's the hard bit. Yeah. And that's the proof that you've got it sort of set up properly.
And it's the infrastructure you build everything else on, right? So
exactly. And change over time happens on everything. So it's, to me, people who work with me get fed up with my ridiculous sayings, but one of them is, if it ain't in Git, it don't exist, basically. So when it's infrastructure, pipeline code, application code, you've got to be able to track this and identify each and every component to a version and manage that over time.
Yeah. And as I said, so, DevOps kind of means different things, different people. As I said at the start, is what are the kind of misconceptions or possibly the misunderstandings? Especially, I feel like either non-engineers or new techies possibly don't realize or understand. What are the most common ones that you kind of come across?
Well, I think the first thing is people think it's a sort of silver bullet. Is the first thing. And actually, it needs the same engineering discipline and the same sort of design application that any other software does. And I see all software the same, with this application, software, testing, infrastructure code. You need that discipline. And people think it's a bit of a silver bullet. They think it's just a bit of this, and you can just do this and you can do that. But then you get into the maintenance nightmare of it all. So that's probably the biggest misconception I see, is that it's just something you can point and click on, and it's very easy now because Amazon. And then they're horrified by the size of the bill they get at the end of the month. So that's one of the misconceptions. The other thing that I've seen quite a bit of, and is that everyone's an expert. That's the other thing, is because you can Google anything and find an article to back up whatever position you hold. Everyone's an expert in this, so everyone has an opinion, but very few people have a lot of experience of actually delivering this stuff, particularly in organizations that need to be, sort of secure and compliant and all this sort of stuff. So it can be quite an uphill struggle. And the third thing, which probably leads on from our initial conversation, is if you're doing it okay, no one notices, and therefore they wonder why they need people with really solid skills, and why these guys who've got sort of 20 years experience are scratching their head in how to best do this sort of thing and all the rest of it. So there's a bit of a lack of, I think, understanding of the importance and the engineering, I'd say, prowess that you need to get it right, basically.
Yeah. So obviously, no need to mention company names, but like previous organizations, DevOps journeys, they start somewhere. Like what tends to, as a business, what do you see like sparks that shift or that first move to trying to get that right and balancing it all together?
Yeah, well, the thing about it is the cloud has been a big driver of it. AWS particularly, Docker, sort of containerization, all this sort of stuff. These are typically the drivers, because you'll typically start with someone who sort of says, Docker, you can just shove it all in Docker and throw it in there, and Amazon will do this. We should be doing that, and that's generally, I found, and it makes sense, But what is as I say, is the complexity of doing that, and all the coverage that you've got to have in that in terms of what you're putting in there. But I've generally found cloud-based applications is really the thing that's brought it to the fore, because once you decide you're going to go down that route and you're going to containerize your applications, then it's sort of, you should be able to do this. Plus, obviously, agile development's another driver. Everyone has to be agile, so we sort of go and do things. But again, it's really, how do you actually genuinely support agile development and delivery? And to me, the only way to do it is to actually engineer yourself in a position to do it. So I think that's what normally drives it. And what I've seen, a number of times, is actually people say, we're going to go agile, we're going to go AWS, and the first thing they'll do is the phrase is always MVP. We're going to go MVP, which means we're going to point and click and all the rest of it. And I sometimes point out there's a V in the middle of that. It says viable, and that's the bit that's often missed out, because if you pointed and clicked and no one knows what's happened, then the viability is sometimes lacking. So I think it is, cloud-based stuff. Startups often want to be something quick. I think they are the main drivers I've seen.
And you touched on this thing. Like, I feel like most of the pressure becomes like, how fast can you ship it? How quick can you get it? Which
exactly,
for non-techies like me, I'm very much like, well, yeah, it's automated, get it done, it's nice and easy, nice and efficient.
Exactly.
How do you balance that versus, because I suppose the most important thing with that infrastructure, security, automation is reliability and stability. How do you balance the speed of shipping stuff to that?
So the good news is, if you actually, again, are aware of those things to start with, you can build them in from the start. And obviously one of the great, it became sort of DevSecOps as well, where you've got to be aware of security right from the off. But to me, the best cure for that is to actually kind of not allow that sort of scope creep and those problems to develop in the first place. So, your sort of access management's quite key. If you can build in your policies and things right from the off that mean that you're going to be compliant, you can be flagged up if things aren't compliant. If you can, sort of just make sure that it's a reasonably controlled environment to start with, that can solve an awful lot of your problems to start with. Once you've got the mechanics in place, then things should happen quickly anyway, and this is one of the things. A lot of the time the speed is there because the mechanics aren't up to the level they need to. Sorry, the speed isn't there because the mechanics aren't up to the level they need to be.
Yeah.
So if you're having problems and people are just telling you to go faster and people are working around things, that you're not really being agile, you're not really implementing DevOps at all.
Yeah.
You're thrashing around like you used to in the old days, but possibly in a more complex environment. So I think it's quite a difficult one to do because you're not going to get the speed unless you get the engineering. But you need, to actually get the engineering to the level it needs to be, you need a bit of time to actually put those foundations in place. Because people do seem to think like Friday we're not agile, Monday we're going agile. Why isn't it all happening straight away?
It's the modern world, right? I want it now. Why hasn't it already started?
Exactly. Yes. So quite difficult.
And I suppose with that, the part of that would be choosing the right DevOps tools for the right jobs.
Yeah.
And I mean, we see it with a lot of our clients. It seems like a who's list of DevOps tools they want experience-wise. When I'm talking to them, I don't think they even know what their priority list of them is.
Yeah.
Are there certain DevOps tools that you think are, awesome, great, fit for purpose, and other ones that are kind of massively overhyped at the moment? Or
I'm fairly tech agnostic because I've been in the game so long. I always think, well, if people get very excited about this product or this tool, there'll be another one along next week. So I'm fairly agnostic. So I generally stick to a fairly standard, widely used set. So typically, if it's infrastructure, I'll go with Terraform, just simply because it has providers for the main cloud, the main cloud services. So I know it's going to work with Azure, Google, AWS, or whatever. Build pipelines again. I've used Jenkins, I've used GitHub Actions, GitLab do similar actions. They're all again much of a muchness, really. So what I tend to do is whatever the aspect you're looking at, is I tend to look at the usage of it. Is it widely used? Because if it wasn't viable, if it didn't do the job, it probably wouldn't be adopted so well. And then also I look at the basis of, if we can make it do what we want it to do, you've got to know what you're looking at for it to do in that first place. But if you can determine it does what you want to do, I tend to go with those things, because also if it's widely used, it does the job, then you can do things like get skills for it as well. Or you can find people and train them up and all the rest of it. So I go for a very boring sort of set. Typically with infrastructure, it'll be Terraform. If I'm looking to do sort of post-deployment stuff to manage, sort of configurations, or if there's stuff I have to deploy straight on virtual machines, I might use Ansible, but there can be some security issues if you're not careful with that as well. Software management, GitHub, GitLab, they're all based on Git. Take your pick. Pipelines, couldn't care less really. Jenkins, GitHub Actions, they all have their nuances, and people get very attached, I find, to particular technology, and I don't understand why, frankly, because I've never in nearly 40 years, it'll be 40 years in this game come next summer. In 40 years, I've never known a technology choice to solve a problem. It's working logic that solves problems. And anyone can take any technology and put the wrong logic on it and it won't work. So I am generally agnostic and look at different aspects of it.
I couldn't agree more with that. Kind of, as you said, I think technology done badly never works, doesn't matter. Yeah, exactly. But you touched on there, you mentioned about the security aspect. That part of it, is that more based depending on what kind of industry or environment you're working on, that you need to be a little bit more cautious about what tools you pick, or it doesn't matter, if you're considering security, this is the kind of tool set you'd use, or how do you pick that?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing with it, one of the really good things about the sort of putting stuff in the cloud is that they'll typically have security capabilities built in. One of the places we was recently, they're all sort of equivalent, but we just happen to be on that AWS platform. And you can put in the security hub implementation there, and you can actually tell it, I want to be compliant with the NIST standard or the ISO 27001 standard or PCI DSS. And if things start going off piste, then it will start flagging this stuff up, And then there's obviously other good tools. You can wire in various tools to talk to these elements. So the thing that also comes back, and one of the things I find people forget a lot is the requirements. The operating model should be driving the technology, not necessarily the other way around, So someone says, we want to be ISO 27001 compliant because it looks good and we can sell more things, or we can get customers confidence if we meet those standards. Then that can translate into engineering that you implement, and it guards you against those things, or at least highlights if you're going off piste.
Yeah.
So again, it's not. I find any platform that's kind of widely used, I expect these facilities to be there. So if someone said to me, I haven't done anything with GCP commercially, if someone said to me, we want to go onto GCP, I'd say, fine, I'll probably deploy it with Terraform. And I expect to see these facilities, and then I'd go and investigate that and maybe even do a training course if I had to. And I would expect to find those facilities. And to me, it wouldn't be a viable platform if it didn't have them. So that's the thing, it's kind of knowing what you expect, and then it's a question of how to put it in. And so really, security shouldn't be a big process of, when the audit comes around, everyone's like, oh no, it's like sort of months of work. It should be a question of, we want to meet this standard, and we want to use the facilities that are in the cloud provider, and we want to actually put the put the sort of policies in place that mean we're compliant, basically. The problem you get is if you've got existing stuff deployed and it's completely not compliant, the question is, how do you migrate from that position to the position of compliancy? That's the really hard one, actually.
I think what we see quite a lot of is, as you said, maybe you said it more politely than I would, but if technology is like not fit for purpose, and then you get the business making decisions around, this is what we want to produce, these are the products we want to get out the door, go and do it. And if you either if you don't have a strong enough or knowledgeable enough kind of head of infrastructure, CTO, that type of person, when they just make a bad situation worse.
And that's precisely the situation that's occurred a couple of times. I've sort of seen that happen, and it's a very difficult one, because if I start talking, about what needs to be done to bring that outcome where they are secure, people just glaze over, unless they're sort of in it, sort of, hey, what, So it's a very, very tricky stakeholder management piece, actually, that to actually convince people that we really kind of need to do this.
How do you overcome that?
I normally say, come and have some lunch or come and have a beer or something, because it's generally, I normally end up pleading over a pint and saying, I'm not saying this for love, for laughs or whatever, it's just that if we don't do this, and if there's a serious problem, your reputation is shot. So, but the problem is that if you haven't had that situation occur, then people think, oh, I don't need to do it. But from the point of view of some of those conversations would probably be easier now, given some of the events of the last few months and things like that with certain large organizations and that than they were say a year ago. So it is very, very difficult, but generally it is a question of, look, I'm not saying this for fun, I'm not trying to make anyone's life difficult with this, but if you do have a problem and we haven't done this stuff, then that's going to be a real problem for the business, because your reputation's shot at that stage.
And as you said, I think obviously recent events that have happened, I think it's easy to look back in hindsight, but back to what you basically said originally, was it's all about making sure that infrastructure environment is set up properly and fit for purpose at the start.
Exactly. Yeah, and being able to manage it over time. That's the other killer. That's the
that was the next thing I was going to ask you. Is how do you, as you evolve, how do you manage that so that it remains fit for purpose over time?
Well, that's a good one, that is, because it all comes down to the engineering side. Is if you can actually build everything to a version. So an environment to me is just a compatible set of versioned components.
Yeah.
So I can have a very complex environment that's made up of like 200 components or whatever. If I know the version of every one of those, then I have an environment version 1 that knows exactly the version of everything in it. If I change one item of that, or I change 20 items of it, as long as I know the compatible set of versions, I can put those together and I have version 2 of my estate. And actually the mechanics, that's exactly how it should be doing. It should be building mechanics so that is what it becomes. Now obviously there's all sorts of risks in terms of the functionality. We'll need test coverage and all the rest of it. So all these elements have to move with the versions. But if you can't inventory what's out there, and use the same mechanics to deploy through your test environments and your staging environments and into production. If you don't have those mechanics, then you can't, sort of have that level of confidence. And there's always, you can always have a configuration issue at the end of the day. But what you're trying to do is just minimize the risk of this. And if you're using the same deployments to deploy through, if you're using the same version configurations to deploy through, you've minimized the risk as far as you possibly can, basically.
Yeah. And I think the other bit of that, which again we see, is in your situation, your ideal is having as much visibility of what's coming up in the future, so you know what to prepare and how to evolve that. Whether it's version 1, 2, 3, 4. The business never thinks about that until they're like, oh, I need a new version because this is where we've told everyone we're going to get to.
But exactly, I mean, even with that, again, if you're tying that back to source code management, it'd just be another feature branch. So every single feature branch delivers a new version.
Yeah.
So you could be releasing this stuff as frequently or as infrequently as you like. You could be going for continuous delivery, although that utopia never really comes about too much in what I've seen. But and also there might be good operating model reasons why they want some manual intervention. But essentially, I'd see the mechanics being exactly the same, whether you're releasing once a month, every 3 hours, whether you have automated delivery or not. The mechanics would be the same, but you just build the operating model as to whether there's any human interaction in there according to the operating model requirements of the organization.
So, slightly left field question, but if you had the opportunity to kind of redesign DevOps from scratch, like there's no budgetary constraints here or business demands. What would you keep? What features would you keep? What would you throw away? What would be your...
I'd probably make less tools, and I'd probably sort of tell people you can't go on Google for about 4 hours a day, basically. So
I feel like that's worse there.
But I mean, essentially, I actually think, I mean, again, coming from where I started in the good old days on sort of, town computers you'd have a team of system engineers. No one knew what they quite did. And if one of them got run over by a bus, he was in trouble, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Coming from those sort of days, I actually think with, judicious use of, sort of software management and the tools that are there, I actually think we're in a pretty good state. My personal feeling is what's lacking is the engineering patterns of implementing this stuff. Because again, it's you get sort of developer autonomy has obviously been a big movement in the last sort of 5-10 years or whatever, and I could be slightly facetious and say, well, you can take development engineering autonomy on one side and put an equal sign, and you could say, sort of engineering chaos on the other. You've got 29 different ways of doing the same thing. Yeah. So I think I just think it would be good to if you get in there where people, I think just pick your tool set and use it. But I actually think the way it's set up is pretty good. There's not much I've seen that you can't do and you can't manage over time if you just keep it simple. You build the basic mechanics in place, and there are some real fundamentals you need to put in place.
Yeah.
But at that point, I look at it, once you've got those mechanics in place, I look at it, we have the capabilities now, more than enough, where it's almost like sort of flat pack IKEA furniture. You sort of put a table together, you sort of plug everything, make sure you've got all the bits, and you get the Allen key out and you start tightening.
Yeah.
Build those mechanics, you can build more and more complexity, more and more sophistication onto these things. But I don't think there's anything I would really sort of redesign or throw away particularly. I would just keep it simple. Yeah, build the core mechanics first, and then you can build out all manner of things off the back of that. And again, sort of you've got things like observability and things like this, where you can incrementally build up to that. So if you had a project going on, you basically get your initial sort of infrastructure mechanics in, your pipeline mechanics in, your accreditation ones, and you can then have parallel streams. You can be building your observability using exactly the same mechanics as everything else in parallel with the development of your application. So there's nothing I can see that really I would change too much. I think it just needs to be used in a bit more disciplined way.
What I find fascinating about that is as you said, having you been involved in like infrastructure for 4 decades, that's like, that with all the tools and stuff that's been invented, we're talking about we just need to take it back to being really simple.
Yeah.
Really well.
And there's stuff now. There's so many good things out there. In terms of both the application engineering, the changes I've seen over the time. Object-oriented languages, what were they when we first started? So you've got all the building blocks and the components, but what I tend to see is, it's just a question of using those and drawing all those together in a coherent piece. Because you should, I'm a firm believer in building sort of foundational blocks, and you can build it up and you can abstract it so it gets easier to use and all the rest of it. But if you don't have those underpinning pieces, you're always sort of pushing treacle up a hill, basically. So it's a bit tricky, really.
And just before I let you go, I'm going to ask you one last one. Is with that in mind, and as I said, I think there's such a myriad of tools and how people use it. Where, like, over the next few years, with the way automation, AI, everything else is being built in, where do you see DevOps going? How do you think people are going to use it?
Well, that's a really interesting one, because there's a couple of items you kind of touched on there. One is AI, and AI is great as long as the bloke who's checking what it's producing knows what he's doing. So, and we've had actually a few not incidents, but myself and an ex-colleague have done a few experiments with that to see what AI would give you the answer, say with authenticating from a automated pipeline to a cloud provider, and they've given you functional answers, but really not the answers you want in terms of a secure implementation. And then you have to go back and chart all the criteria, and then it'll come out, and eventually it'll come back. But if you didn't come from a position of knowing what you're looking for and what should be done and why it should be done that way, you wouldn't know enough to tighten the criteria enough to give you AI to give you the right answer. So there is an element of danger there. I'm not convinced, again, that's the silver bullet that people hope and think it is. I think it's actually could be quite dangerous in the wrong hands, basically. And the other thing I've heard recently is that there's a bit of a movement, people, to go back to on-prem management, which is a really interesting one, because that, to me, almost looks like raising the white flag with what you've been doing in the cloud, basically. So that's interesting. I don't think. I hope that particular one won't catch on too much. So I think what possibly will happen is that obviously the AI side of it, if it becomes more refined, more sophisticated, all the rest of it, you could be at a stage where it will do a lot for you. But my personal feeling is that it should just become a more pattern-based way of doing things. The same way that there are so many places out there doing the same things essentially in different ways. Whereas actually, I don't see any reason why it can't become pattern-based. And maybe if the AI side of it becomes more sophisticated, the patterns will become more consistent because people are using that to actually deliver it.
Do you think with that? Because I think I completely agree with you. I think considering most of the vast majority of our clients are kind of tech startup, I'm amazed at how much money they spend on initially getting, as you said, MVP, but V being the operative word of market, that how much money they burn through before they get the right infrastructure platform in place. And I'm amazed that there's not, as you said, a plug and play. You could have different versions, iterations as your business grows and scales that you can change it to and plug it into. Start off with. I feel like they burn so much cash early on.
Exactly.
Right. And then effectively probably build a product or an application that they then have to migrate to something else because actually their infrastructure is not fit for purpose. I'm amazed that's not something that happens more often already.
And that's absolutely spot on. I think that is something that happens. Quite a number of places I've been where people just can't seem to get this stuff over the line. I think it should just become more pattern based. But obviously, your patterns need to actually be functional, be viable for that to happen. But in actual fact, once they're defined and running, it really shouldn't be too much work to be able to say, we're going to crank a handle and be able to do this, and then you've got to look at the delta of any specific requirements that you have, and even those might be very, very pattern based. Because if you look at, say, I don't know, the AWS site, and you look at landing zone, it gives you a sort of a reference implementation for how you separate your security stuff and your management stuff and your prod stuff and your non-prod stuff. So really, it should just be a question of almost defining those patterns, being able to crank a handle to give you that base reference architecture. And then it comes down to, okay, what are your particular requirements? And that may mean that you apply different accreditation standards, or you possibly have a more complex egress stuff if you've got stuff on-prem and stuff in the cloud and all this sort of stuff. But again, with an application, there's only about 15, 20 patterns of egress you can end up with anyway, So ultimately, I think it should almost be like picking from a menu, of things. But you're right. I haven't yet.
this is your next career path, Matt. I can see.
Maybe, yes, indeed, yes, yeah. And that's if I don't have to mow the lawn again. So yeah.
Look, Matt, I really appreciate you joining me on Talking Tech. I think it's a fascinating subject, and actually, funny enough, I think it's something that, as you said, it's just good engineers with those type of brains for problem solving and setting up, like, they don't get enough credit, because I think businesses spend a lot of time and money wasted in that department.
I think so too. Yeah, I would say that though.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. So, look, I really appreciate it, and thank you very much for joining me on Talking Tech.
No, thanks for having me.
Not at all.